Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. April 15th marks the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic 108 years ago in 1912, and no doubt you've seen one of the many representations of that historic event in our popular culture, most famously, probably, James Cameron's 1997 film, Titanic. Now, there were several Georgians on board that night, or people with ties to Georgia, most famously Archibald Butt, who was a military aide to both Presidents William Howard Taft and before that, Theodore Roosevelt. But I want to tell you about a Georgian who was on board that night, who was a writer whose work has been largely forgotten about in the 21st century, but who was very famous at the time of his death. I'm talking about a writer named Jacques Futrelle, who was born in 1875 in Pike County, Georgia. At the young age of 18, Jacques got a job at the Atlanta Journal, where he is credited with creating the sports department there. Jacques got married in 1895 when he was 20 years old to a woman named Lily Mae Peel, who was an Atlanta native. They had two children, Virginia and John Jr., in the last 5 years of the 19th century. And Jacques, pursuing his journalism career, moved his family to the Northeast and got a job with the William Randolph Hearst paper, the Boston American. He was working there in 1905 when he created a literary character who was very quickly hailed as one of the best successors of Sherlock Holmes in existence. He created a character known as the Thinking Machine, Professor Augustus SFX Van Dusen. Now, Professor Van Dusen appeared in over 50 short stories and two novels. The most famous short story was called The Problem of Cell 13. And Futrelle specialized in what became known as locked room mysteries, and they were exactly what they sounded like. The professor was a very cerebral version of Sherlock Holmes, and through sheer analysis and reason, he was able to solve mysteries. Futrelle succeeded to the point that he was able to quit his day job in 1906 and become a full-time writer. And it was in that capacity that he and his wife traveled to London in 1912, hoping to expand his audience in Europe. They spent a couple of months there, and on the night of April 9th, Futrelle, his wife, and some friends celebrated his 37th birthday. And the very next morning, they rushed down to Southampton, where they had booked a first-class cabin on the RMS Titanic. Now, you know the story of what happened. On the night of the 14th, the Titanic struck an iceberg, and in the early morning hours of the 15th, it sank, and over 1,500 people perished. Now, Mrs. Futrelle got into a lifeboat. They were both wearing life jackets. She got into a lifeboat, got back out in the hopes of persuading him to join her. He said, "Think of our children," who by that time were 15 and 13 years old. Persuaded her to get back into a lifeboat and assured her that when he could, he would get in one or cling to the side of one in the North Atlantic. The last time she saw him, he was standing on the deck of the ship next to John Jacob Astor, smoking a cigarette. He went down with the ship. His body was never recovered. Now, Mrs. Futrelle, her lifeboat was picked up by the Carpathia, went to New York, and within 2 weeks she had written one of the first eyewitness accounts of the sinking of the Titanic. Futrelle's mother supposedly died of grief over the death of her son and died in July, just 3 months later. But before she died, she had a cenotaph erected in Pike County to her son, which you can still see today. Mrs. Futrelle spent the rest of her life promoting her husband's writings. She didn't die until the ripe old age of 91 in 1967, and every year on April 15th, on the anniversary of his death, she would cast a bouquet of flowers into the North Atlantic in his memory. If you're looking for something to read during this coronavirus pandemic lockdown, let me suggest that you go on your Kindle and you download all the short stories of the Thinking Machine, particularly The Problem of Cell 13, and make the acquaintance of Professor SFX Van Dusen. I think you'll like it. As we remember a Georgian who died on the Titanic this week 108 years ago. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Thanks so much for watching.